Okay, so Douglas and I were trying out the Zoom format in some ways because we're forced to, as Singapore has just entered into another lockdown. And so we can't actually do our regular shooting as we did in intro videos. But we actually wanted to do this experiment, and it's quite appropriate to the topic of the book that we're reviewing tonight. So
Yeah,
Douglas, yeah.
So tonight's topic is about the joy of missing out, right? And it's actually based on a book by a Danish psychologist called Svend Brinkmann. Yeah. So like what Unsu said, right? We are now in the middle of a lockdown, and the idea is that obviously we can't do a lot of things. So just to give some examples for, say, international audiences, like, we can't dine out, so we were not allowed to dine out anymore. So say goodbye to meeting with friends in restaurants. We are not allowed to be in groups of more than 2. So even if you want to take in some guests, we only allowed 2 unique visitors a day. Gyms have been shut, so we can't work out, we can't exercise, unless it's very under strict conditions. And yeah, so life has somewhat come to a standstill for most of us. But here we are trying to make the best of it, and hence the relevance of tonight's topic, right? So let me just give a very quick introduction, all right, to what the idea is, right? What's the problem that we're dealing with? So I'm going to read something from the book. So essentially,
by the way, sorry, Douglas, to interrupt you, but do you actually have a physical book to hold up to?
Let me just, so I'm actually using an electronic reader, but I have exactly on the page itself. Let me try to get to the cover page very quickly. Hold on, yeah. Hold on. See, when you ask me to do something like this, I get very nervous. Oh. Okay, here we go. Hope everyone can see it. So there's a little smiley face at the top, like a balloon of a smiley face, right? And it's just a white cover that says the joy of missing out. Yeah. So so let's first talk about what is the problem that Svend is trying to address. So I think all of us are familiar with this idea, FOMO, which is the fear of missing out, right? And how Svend actually defines it is that FOMO, right, is basically a question about being in a world which is full of choice and temptation. Yeah. I'm going to read directly from the book. It says like this: we are constantly bombarded with invitations in the broader sense of the word via everything from street advertising to social media. We're constantly invited to do something, think something, experience something, buy something, consume something. And that competition for our attention spans is fierce. And when inundated by overwhelming amounts of information, it's sometimes difficult to distinguish what is important from what is not, right? So in understanding that this is the problem as we have it right now, right, what Svend is actually recommending as a solution is that in order to live a rich, full, and flourishing life requires a degree of self-mastery and self-control, right? And it's about knowing how to say no has a value. There's a value in saying no. And also as a prerequisite for our ability to do our best as the individuals that we want to be, with the responsibilities that we have, and in the context that we happen to find ourselves. So I think this is a very nice elucidation of like what the book is trying to talk about, and like how we are constantly bombarded with so many options, and it's difficult to make choices. It's difficult to decide, what should we miss out on. And so, me and Unsu obviously feel like this is such a pertinent topic that we want to, make a full video on it. So before I go on, right, let me ask you, Unsu. So does even the concept of FOMO, does it even relate to you at all? Yeah, whether is it you or people around you?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I've definitely experienced FOMO many times in my life, and like even after making a decision, like let's say choosing not to go out with some friends because like I'm feeling tired and just want to stay home, and then but even after making that decision, like just regretting it, or feeling like, oh, maybe I would have been better off going with them.
Right.
And even with like the stuff that we love to do, like reading, like I love to, I would love to read so many books, but you only have limited time. So even the choice to read one book means I have to forego reading 10 other books on my list. And, you know, again, there's that fear of missing out. Like, what if...
I understand the pain.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, no, it's something that I identify with.
Yeah, so for me, like, yeah, this is interesting actually, because we're going to sound a little bit similar, but I'll try to talk about how I personally feel this concept affects, you know, like not just us per se, but even people around us. So I think that obviously with the advent of social media, right, people see all kinds of experiences of other people, right, and these other people can look like they have great lives, right, like they're going on wonderful trips, they go to the most scenic holiday locations, they're having great nice meals, luxurious meals, and high-class settings. And you know, we're constantly bombarded with that. You know, if you don't have a social media account, you won't understand it, but it's out there, it's very pervasive. And even for someone like me, you know, like when I thought about my sense of FOMO, I know I'm not like a consumerist person, so it's not like when I see someone going on a nice holiday, I feel like, oh man, I wish I was there. But I also realized that in my own sense, right, like I do seek experiences. So like when I hear about people who are traveling, I feel kind of bad sometimes. I feel like, hey, you know, I don't have the means to travel, and you know, I feel like I missed out on that. Like if someone goes to an exotic country, I feel bad, like as if, you know, I wish I could be there. So that's one. I also have a sense, just like similar to you, where I'm constantly looking for the next fix when it comes to education. So books is definitely a very good example. So I'm constantly sometimes, and I think you probably have seen a little bit of this from me by now, where I'm looking for the next new book to get and to read. And I actually am very cognizant that I fall to this habit of like acquiring books, but not really digesting the material. So I'm hoping that's why this channel is, you know, actually forcing me to do something about that. And just in my own professional career as well, like I'm also looking for self-development courses, and not now, but definitely like at least 5 to 10 years ago, I had really like the symptoms of FOMO, because if I see a course being coming to Singapore, and you know, and if I see some of my colleagues in the industry going for it, I feel like I'm missing out. I feel like I got to go for the next course and the next course, and you know, even though it can be maybe not so relevant for me, or it's not as valuable as what I really require, but you know, there's that dread, like as if I'm not catching up. Yeah. And so yeah, so when I read this book, and just to give our viewers some timeline, so we read this book I would say a couple of weeks back, for me much earlier, probably a couple of months back. So there was so much that I love about the book, and you know, really delighted that we can actually take it online today to talk about it. Yeah. So before we start getting into nitty-gritty, right, why not you tell me a little bit about your reactions overall to the ideas, and which ones do you like, the arguments and the concept from the book?
Well, first of all, what I like about the book is that it's short. So it's actually something that, you know, like you can finish reading in a few days, or at most a week, right? And these days when I leave so many books unfinished, it actually feels good to complete something, you know, have that sense of closure. I also liked how he came at the problem from different angles. And, you know, like really setting himself up a challenge, right? Like, how do you convince people that there's actually a joy to missing out on things? You know, that's quite a tough challenge. And so, you know, he breaks it up into 5 different types of philosophical arguments. And I may forget all of them, but they're political, existential, ethical, aesthetic.
Yeah, aesthetics. Yeah. So I can just name 5 for our viewers. So political is the first one, ethical, existential, psychology, and aesthetics. Yeah.
Yeah.
So like you know, it's going to be really hard for us to obviously cover all 5 of them. So do you at least, you know, have one in particular that you like, you know, just to kickstart the ball rolling?
Yeah, I think the one that worked best for me was the aesthetic argument. Maybe because I'm a filmmaker, you know, so I've always thought of life as a work of art, right? Like that my own life is a work of art that I'm working on. So yeah, you know, and given that I only read it recently, you know, like I'm sure you share the same thing. A lot of times, once I put down a book, like a few days later, I forget 80% of it. So I'm actually gonna talk about the book without like this perfect clarity of memory about it, but it's more just what are the remnants of it, what has stuck with me, right?
Yeah.
And I may even be remembering wrongly, but
No, don't worry.
I like the, you know, from what I remember, the aesthetic argument was basically that for something to have meaning, it has to have form, right? And to have a form, it has to be finite. So even, you know, just to talk about art form that I'm familiar with, like filmmaking, you know, like to make a good film, you have to make hard choices. You know, you might have your favorite scene, but it just doesn't work within the story that you're trying to tell. And, you know, and as a filmmaker, like you have these memories of being on a set, the hard work that it took to shoot a certain scene, you know, maybe spending 12 hours to get that scene. And it's painful to let it go, but you have to, you know, for the sake of the work of art. So for me, the aesthetic argument makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, so this is going to be really interesting because actually the aesthetic argument, just to clarify, like I like the sophistication of argumentation there, because, and we're going to talk about this a little bit about his suggestion to use rituals, right, to build a certain aesthetics about life, right? And you know, I'm just skeptical about the effectiveness of it. So we'll talk about that a bit later. But I actually have a really fun example to talk about this part of the book. Okay, so just to give the viewers a sense, right? Okay, what do we mean when we talk about aesthetics? So, like as you mentioned, Unsu, as a filmmaker, you're talking about, you know, the idea of beauty, the idea about what does something look like, you know, and what is the narrative, especially for when we look at our own lives, what kind of narratives are we living, right? And in the book, Svend actually uses Foucault to talk about the aesthetics of existence, because he's saying that Foucault wants us to bring back this idea about looking at our life as a concept, as a narrative, and examining it, you know, in terms of its moral good, right? So here's a really, really funny example. Okay, so this just happened just a few days ago. I just saw this news story. So there's a really pretty Japanese biker who's very popular on Twitter. Okay, she's very, very pretty. And, you know, lots of thousands of likes, right? And this is what I mean about social media. So this Japanese female biker posts a lot of pictures. So the Japanese media gets very intrigued by it. One wants to know who she is, and they investigate. And what they uncover is that this person is actually a 50-year-old uncle. What actually has been happening is that he's been using filters to really reconfigure his face. So he really, really comes out looking really very pretty. Okay, I don't know whether we want to put in the pictures later, but you know, for post-production. But I felt this was a really good example because this is a person who's trying to build a certain aesthetics about himself, right? And I was curious. I went to check out his page. So he's obviously lost a lot of followers by now. But he wrote something intriguing. He wrote something that, you know, was something like, I'm paraphrasing here, but I choose to define myself the way I want to be. And, you know, it's quite like thought-provoking, right? Because at the same time, I guess we want to believe that we as an individual have the freedom to define ourselves as we choose to. And obviously that plays a little bit into certain concepts of existentialism and freedom. But here's where Svend's point comes in very clearly. Is it ethical though? And that's the thing he wants us to think about when it comes to aesthetics, right? So this Japanese uncle, right? I mean, we actually can ask a reasonable question whether his actions are ethical. Does it make sense to be a good person, to fool the rest of the world that you are a pretty Japanese girl when you truly are a 50-year-old uncle, right? So, you know, like, I felt like this is a good way to kind of hit the point for our viewers, right? So when you look at your life, look at the way you present yourself, whether it's on social media or, you know, maybe with the clothes that you wear or the way you talk to your social circle, are you really meeting a certain standard of truth that is also ethical to your values? Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the strength of Brinkmann's approach is that he's not just focusing on one argument over the others, right? So, like, if you just took aesthetics as a benchmark, yeah, like this guy who disguised himself as a pretty Japanese girl, like, you know, he would pass the aesthetics test. But he wouldn't pass the ethics test. So I think it's good to have the convergence of all these different points of view.
Yeah. So yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm curious. So which of the 5 arguments was strongest for you?
So for me, I really like the one that has to do. So there's 2 mainly that I really like. The psychological, and the one about existential. So but before I go into that, right, just a quick one. Do you want to talk about the idea, because we're on the topic of aesthetics, do you want to talk about the idea about ritualization? Do you want me to define it a little bit so we can kind of discuss this?
Sure.
Yeah. So he quotes the anthropologist Mary Douglas, sorry, just to clarify, Mary Douglas, right, about how rituals are a good way to kind of frame social relations so that we know our communities better, right? And rituals are, a measure or a tool to define, the identity of the society and the individuals that live within it. And, he even quotes, sometimes referring to my notes here, sociologist Anthony Giddens as well, who talks about how society now is very different from the past, because we are now very free to arrange our experiences and to, even discard rituals. So, and all of this is done really because we are trying to define our own identity and to maximize our own freedoms, right? But to Svend, this is really a bad move, because to him, right, and he uses the example, which, okay, I do like this one, a Japanese tea ceremony or marriages, right? Like, he looks at this traditional rituals as ways to help us connect with, the people around us, the relationship of the people around us, and the concepts that we, or the values that we live in, right? So just to kind of say why, like I said, the strength of the argument is there. I definitely understand it to some degree that rituals serve a very useful function. My problem with it is that I think it's, okay, so this is where I get a little bit, like, I'm generalizing a little bit here, obviously. And it's a bit of like my philosophical take on human nature. I don't feel like most people reflect on their lives aesthetically. So, like, if you even ask me personally, do I know what kind of identity am I basing myself on? I mean, there is some sense of it, but I don't have it actually nailed down to certain rituals. At least, in some sense, the way I lead my life is kind of like defined by my values, but I actually can kind of see it that maybe the rest of society doesn't share those practices with me. And I like to think that, sure, I'm not the most ethical person on earth, but neither am I the most unethical. And, that's why, like, I don't necessarily, I'm not saying that, like I said, the argument is flawed or now, but just that I think it's a hard sell. Yeah. But I like it though. I mean, I like that, like, for example, when we're talking about this right now, we are trying to appease people to kind of reflect on their lives and to look at it aesthetically. But I just wonder whether it's very effective. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm someone, actually, for most of my life, I've really been against rituals. Like, I've never enjoyed many traditional rituals, and have always wanted to structure my days pretty loosely. But I think that as I get older, I am recognizing that, some ritual in life is important as a way to mark the cyclical nature of time. And, I think, like, and maybe this is a way to look back to the beginning of his book. What I thought was one of the more powerful things he brought my attention to is just this idea, how pervasive the idea of development is, right? Like, whether you're talking about developing our societies, our economies, or personal development, it's something we just don't question. I mean, just reflecting on the past 2 weeks, I've been in so many conversations with different people who would talk about the need to develop human potential, and to develop children, even with my wife, right? Like, there's all these conversations about how do we want to develop our kids, and he points out it's almost unthinkable to say, actually, I'm happy with where we are. I don't need to develop anymore, like, and so, like, to question, yeah, why is that so unthinkable for us to suggest? So to bring it back to ritual, I think ritual is a way of getting ourselves comfortable with the fact that, oh, things are just gonna stay the same. It's not always gonna be this endless treadmill of novelty and growth, and like the seasons, like Christmas, it's always gonna come in December, and I think it made more sense in maybe like agricultural or rural communities where you're really very intimately tied to the seasons and farming, and I think in urban communities it's a lot harder to have that connection to ritual.
Yeah, that's a very good point you brought up, because it depends on the kind of society you live in, right? I should say also, on the stronger part of these arguments about rituals, like he quotes the idea of, like, say, like a national historical day. So let's say in Germany, if you were to kind of like, well, commemorate is not the right word, but you reflect on the days of World War II and obviously how the country fell into Nazism. Like, that's a good example of a ritual which can really help a country heal and reconnect with their past, what was maybe sinful about it as well, but also how they can move on from there. So I do think that maybe my sense of it is that when we talk about rituals, I like the ritual to be something really deep and something that hits on a very emotional level. So if you talk about like maybe surface level rituals, like maybe happy birthdays, for example, like on the one hand, I wouldn't discount them as unimportant, but we both know that, like, as we get older, birthdays don't count as much to some degree. And, it matters more like how that ritual is conducted and how, we may even look at how the person who's organizing the ritual, like what's their intentions behind it, right? So if they organize something that can be simple, let's say a simple happy birthday, but the design of the birthday party is really meaningful, then yeah, that ritual has performed its a really good function there. But yeah, but the idea really is that we have to examine on a case-by-case basis what kind of rituals we're talking about. Yeah, and I do like what Stephen at least encourages us to do, which is to look at our systems and to see whether the rituals that our systems produce, right, like what are they trying to work on. And as you brought out, right, are they trying to work on us hitting the next hedonistic fix or desire, or are we really trying to ground ourselves and consolidate like a certain kind of identity, or to meet a certain maybe catharsis? So yeah, so I think that's it really depends a lot on what the ritual is about. Yeah. So you asked me, like, and actually you hit just on the right note when you talk about the hedonistic treadmill, right? So that's the part of the book that I really like. So so that's actually the psychological part. And just for our viewers to know that Svend is actually a psychologist by profession. Yeah. So this part of the book is really strong, and there's some things I just want to share. So just give me a few minutes. So he starts that chapter with the idea about the marshmallow test. So just to let our viewers know, it's basically a psychological test replicated thousands of times by now. The pioneers are Walter Mischel, and the idea is that they subject children to a test about marshmallows and whether they can delay gratification. So without going into the bits of it, the idea is that children who are found to be able to delay gratification, the long-term social research results show that they generally have better outcomes in life. But Svend actually makes the point that, like, even if that being the case, but it really doesn't say anything about individuals, because a kid could maybe perform very poorly early in life on this particular behavioral trait, but they can grow up in life being quite healthy, and they may eventually also learn how to be in control, to delay gratification and exhibit good forms of self-control. So anyway, the idea here is that what Svend points to is that given that, right, like when we ask ourselves, right, when we delay gratification, right, the question should be asked, what are we delaying that gratification for? And in most cases, it's about a bigger reward, right? So if you, for example, told me that you're going to give me a marshmallow, but if I wait 5 minutes longer, I can get a bigger marshmallow, that would be a reason to delay that. But, he has this really good example, and us being parents, I think we would like this example, where he says that, if we look at our children, right, and we want them to share their toys with other children, we don't tell them that, hey, if you share your toy, we will reward you with something. We want them to share, their toys willingly, right, and autonomously. And if you look at someone who tries to do something altruistic, but it's at the cost, it's at the it's for the reason of getting a bigger reward. We look at such people as selfish and opportunistic, and we know that that's pretty unethical. It's not an ethical behavior that we admire. So, to me, I think that is one of the things that we need to think about in society, because this thing about the self-control thing, it's really pretty much heavily marketized by now, because there are lots of books for parents to try to teach their children to practice this self-control trait. But we're not asking the question about like what are we doing it for, right? So the idea here is that he then brings in Søren Kierkegaard to talk about how when we want to practice this kind of self-restraint, there should be a bigger purpose behind it. And he calls it purity of heart, to will some kind of ethical good out of it. And this, makes a very strong ethical case for like the reason to have self-restraint, because we are trying to achieve something bigger, something much more altruistic at the end of it, even if it's going to cost us. Yeah. So I feel like this is an idea that, it's not really regularly talked about in our discourse. What do you feel?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could elaborate more on how that line of reasoning leads to the idea that we actually feel more joy when we miss out.
Yeah, so I think that is actually the big question at the end of the day. Because to me, after digesting everything, I'm not questioning the book, obviously. I obviously like it a lot. I just question maybe the use of the word joy. Because, I mean, under like a dictionary, I guess you would say joy is defined as exuberance and, some form of exaggerated happiness, I guess, right? Over the top happiness. And I have to say that when I think about the things that I'm going to try to practice in terms of like not feeling bad about missing out, I don't know whether I'll call it joy. I would call it contentment. Yeah. And, to me, it's like, I think what the book actually serves to do is to remind us that we may not feel, it may be very hard. And in fact, the book does make a point about that, right? Like, which is, we are always going to cave in a little bit to our desires. And it's not wrong per se. I mean, we are going to be constantly be tempted, but we need to somewhat take some pride in the idea that we can choose to say no. And that's another important part of the book, where he says that our identity is not only just defined by what we do, but what we don't do. And he uses the psychoanalyst Adam Phillips here. The quote that he has is, the unlived life is worth examining. Yeah, and it's a beautiful quote, because just to explain to our viewers, so think of this, right? Like, you're limited by what you can do. And that's the idea about the whole thesis, which is we cannot fool ourselves into the delusion that we are capable of everything under the sun. We clearly are not. There are biological limits, there are physical limits, there are all sorts of limits, societal limits as well, as to what we can actually choose to do in life. But by not choosing to do certain things, or not being able to achieve certain things, and maybe even having a dream, right? Like, say for me, maybe a dream is like writing my first novel. So maybe I never achieve it in my life, but to some degree, I'm also defined by that. Maybe perhaps by the efforts that I've tried, maybe by the ideas that I have. And what Svend is basically saying is that defines me too, because there are many things that we can't do in life, and that kind of defines us. So like I said, I think overall together, I prefer to call it like contentment. Contentment, knowing that fine, maybe I won't achieve everything in life, but maybe I gave it a best shot, or I chose values. I chose certain values. Certain values matter to me more, in in terms of having the outcomes that I have. So yeah. What about you?
No, I really like that, the concept of that we are defined by what we are not, because it makes me think of a negative image, like a photograph is the negative image, and evolution as well. Like, we are actually defined by all our ancestors that never made it, who died off that, that creates the outline of who we are today. So definitely like that.
What do you make of, there's one part of the book, just to jog your memory, where he talks about the value of moderation. and he actually uses Aristotle, right, to describe like how virtue can be found as the means between two extremes. So one example he has is about courage, right? So courage is about doing something even though you fear doing it. So on the extreme end will be cowardice, right? So you're a coward, you give in to your fear, you don't do it. The other extreme end will be arrogance. You have a legitimate reason to be fearful, but you still foolishly think that you can do it. So to him, he says like the most best solution, somewhat is like the means between two extremes, right? And so he harkens back to Aristotle and how and Stoic philosophy, obviously, about how it's good to be moderate. So I thought this would probably be very strong and very appealing for you. Was it?
Yeah, no, I've always been drawn to Aristotle's theory of moderation. I think it's also called the golden mean. But I think one issue that I have with that is that in order for me to know what is moderate or what is in the middle, it actually takes other people to set an example of what the extremes are.
Yeah.
We kind of need people to set those kind of both sides of that goalpost. Because if everyone was the same, then we would have no concept of what is extreme or what is moderate. So I don't know. It's a useful personal philosophy, I think. But I don't know how you would apply it to everyone who is living on Earth. It feels like someone has to be extreme in something to act as a mirror or reflection for other people.
Yeah. So I did wrestle with this concept a little bit as well. I mean, I was thinking it in a political way, so maybe that's not the right way to think of it, because I don't think he meant it that way as well. So just as a kind of preface to viewers, like, so sometimes in the discourse it's said that, you got capitalism on one hand and socialism on the other hand. And, to me, like, it doesn't mean that the best solution is the means, like the middle of these two extremes. Because honestly, it depends on the society, it depends on the infrastructure and the makeup of the case study that we're talking about. Yeah. So I struggled a little bit with this, but there is one line from the book that helped a little bit, where he says that you can also be too extreme in your moderation. So he cites the case of like someone who's always trying to find the middle, and that can also be not a very worthwhile, not a very well thought of kind of solution. So to him, moderation really means that when you're presented with two extreme choices, you are trying to find a way to unify and to reconcile what is, I guess you could say, fair and equitable for both sides. And I mean, that's really hard, right? Because don't even think about politics. I mean, you can make things like maybe our personal relationship. Someone, wants something, the other person wants something, and then you have to work it out what you like to do on your anniversary, for example. So I guess there is some value in it, but the idea is the nitty-gritty, the details about like, okay, what is the outcome, and whether even when you find that solution, have you really met the ethical and the satisfaction, values of whatever the two extremes are. So that's my takeaway. I mean, I still think that overall, better to be moderate than not, but I look at and you're right. Sometimes I look at myself and I think I've got pretty radical ideas in life. So I don't think that's necessarily unethical. Yeah, or that's the wrong choice. Yeah.
Well, there's a great saying that I love: everything in moderation, including moderation itself.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about let's see. Yeah, okay, maybe let's move on. I think there's quite a number of ideas that we fleshed out there. So after reading the book, right, have you thought about like in the local context, like how these ideas would apply?
Well, not in depth, but I definitely think like, like in Singapore, we have this concept of being Kiasu, right? Which in a way is like fear of losing, which is in a way fear of missing out. So in some ways, this book is very relevant to the local context. Like, how do we combat this, aspect of our culture? And I think this idea of not wanting to lose, he actually addresses directly in the beginning. I think it was near the part where he talks about moderation. He talks about the other virtue, another Greek virtue called magnanimity. And he actually used a very striking example of World War One. And after the Germans lost, the Allies imposed really harsh reparations on them. And in hindsight, that could possibly have led to World War II. Like the Germans suffered so much that they vowed to like get vengeance on the Allies. And he makes the point that sometimes even when you think that you deserve something, it's actually worth considering to take less than your due, right? Which is a really hard sell to most people, but I actually think it's very applicable. Even in, let's say, my marriage, very early on, there was, my wife was studying the Gottman approach. He's this pretty well-known researcher in successful marriages and relationships. And one of the principles he had was like a successful marriage is when both people are actually competing with each other to see who will lose more, and we kind of like it, that principle kind of stuck with us. And there have been times when it has really helped me, because there are a lot of times when I feel I'm in the right and and whatever, but using this principle, it allows me to say, okay, this time I don't need to win every battle, and it actually helps a relationship, right? So I think in a society, if we all had that attitude of we don't always have to win, things would be so much better.
Yeah, I think that hits very strongly on this idea that if you're always thinking about trying to win, right? And I got the perfect example, Donald Trump, right? What do we think of a guy like that, right? Like someone who's very egoistical, someone that is giving, that wants other people as well to give in to his desires. Yeah. And here's the thing, right? Which is you brought up marriage, and I think I was going to talk about this as well, because Svend also has this example about how when you look at marriage, right? Well, let me backtrack a little bit, because he actually relies on this philosopher, Harry Frankfurt, and the essay is called The Importance of What We Care About. So the idea is that he's saying that philosophy needs to pay more attention to this idea that, more than just about what we think about or more than how we should act, it also matters like what do we ought to care about, in an abstract kind of way. So he uses this example of a doctor who takes care of an elderly lady, and this elderly lady is, has chronic pain. But this lady actually tells the doctor that actually the pain doesn't bother me so much. It's my garden roses, because to her, it was more important about the state and the quality of her garden. Yeah, and life is like that, right? So in marriage, for example, right, since you brought it up, right, when we care for a partner, right, how do we define care for our partner? If we want a partner to always give in to our desires and to our whims and fancies, that's not a sign of care, right? Like caring for our partner obviously would mean that we place something above and beyond our own desires. And, obviously it would be the quality of the relationship, and that you're willing to do some kind of ethical good for your partner. And here's the other thing about this whole concept, right? Which is the reality of life is that you don't always get what you want. And speaking as someone who's divorced, you may lose out at some point. So, not all marriages last, for example. To me, another important concept, which always is on the back of my mind, is that your children may not grow up loving you. And so that is the challenge of life, which is like we want to still do these things, and we want to perform up to our duties because there is some ethical good that we care about. So in this case, it could be love to your partner, to your children, and even if one day that is not going to be rewarded, but it matters a lot that we still do it. And that's a very different concept versus someone who's always thinking of like, what do I get out of this? What do I get out of being married to this person? Or what do I get out of having children? Will my children take care of me when I grow old? And I think it's a very common day ideas which people do have, and it's a reflection of that whole ideology of fear of missing out, or constantly looking to maximize your own self gain. So this is one way that I think like how we can see this can apply to our very personal lives. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was also going to say anyway, when it comes to the local context as well, that like for me, like you brought it up, the Kiasu-ism, and here's another important part, right, about our discussion, which is Svend also makes the point that there's only so much you can expect from willpower. So we talk about moderation and all that kind of stuff. And actually, I have written down in my notes, like he has a 5-point guide. We can talk about that maybe in a conclusion. But the idea is that he actually recognizes that, and it goes back to the ritual discussion, that we actually need to work our systems, reshape them, reform them, so that we don't all constantly have to fight this fear of missing out, right? This temptation, and also, making sure that our kids have everything. So obviously, when we look at ourselves, and here's an important part about fear of missing out, I guess, which is it's not just about consumeristic desires as well, because like you and I have children, and I'm sure you may feel the same kind of peer pressures of like, hey, do your kids have piano lessons? Do they have gymnastic lessons? Do they, have they gone for, all sorts of other extracurricular activities? Have you made sure that they're going to be developed into a holistic person? And I think, it's very legitimate fears, but it's, for one, very suffocating. But two, it misses the bigger point, right? What do we want our children to be? Not to be made into a talented person. Like that's not the most important goal in life, but really like, their character and whether they grow up being good people. And we miss that if we are constantly thinking about all this other stuff about like filling them up with all sorts of activities and making sure that they meet, some kind of instrumental ends. Yeah.
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 Yeah, I mean, one point I wanted to make about the book is that actually, there's nothing incredibly new about what he's saying. I mean, in fact, this is all ancient wisdom. Like so much of it makes me think of even just Buddha's insights. I mean, Buddha was a guy who lived in a palace. He was a prince, and he gave everything up, right? So to me, he's like one of the ultimate examples of someone who confronted his fear of missing out. And a lot of like Buddhist teachings are about what you just said about like, how do we care about something and yet be not too attached with the outcome? So, we're not completely like just can't be bothered about achieving or striving for something. Like we're still striving, but yeah, we're not too attached to the outcomes of our struggle.
Yeah, so it's true. Like Svend makes the point that he's really rehashing old ideas, and like a lot of philosophy right now. I mean, as in popular philosophy books are trying to revive ancient ideas, right? So like Stoicism and all that. And I guess it again shows what we mean. Like we don't need always new stuff. Yeah, sometimes the old stuff still works as well. It's just more about like, how well thought of and the quality of the old stuff, right? Like it still has so much relevance and meaning to our lives. Yeah. So anyway, you brought up Buddha, but short of us trying to be Buddha ourselves, now I think it's a good point to get into the 5 steps as to how he wants people to, how do we practice this idea of the joy of missing out, right? So first thing he says, okay, I'm just going to read it out so that I want your reactions after I spill out the 5 steps. So number 1, convince yourself that the idea that only best is good enough is nonsense, right? When something is good enough, it is good enough, right? And if you're constantly chasing for the best, that can lead to despair. Second one, make your decisions irreversible, right? So if you are constantly agonizing whether, hey, this person that you pick as your partner, is she the right one, or would there be someone else better after that, right? Then you're always constantly falling into the trap of like, hey, there may be something better out there. And so some decisions like marriage have to be somewhat irreversible, right? Practice gratitude. Easier said than done, but he thinks it's important. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that as well later. The point that I brought up is that do expect to be hooked, do expect sometimes to to be attracted and, to give into some kind of desire. And, it's going to be very temporary, but, these things do happen. And I guess this one's also quite important as well to me, which is resist the urge to compare. So a good way of putting it is that the grass will always look greener on the other side, but why not just focus on your own lawn and, spend time doing your own thing instead of worrying about what other people are doing. Yeah. So what's your reactions?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of it is fairly good advice. In fact, I'm one of those people who like, this book was really preaching to the converted, right? Like it didn't need to convince me. Like, these were things that, even when I was in school, I was practicing the first principle. Like I just didn't think it was worth being the top in class. Like I could see the amount of work it would take to be there. Like it just wasn't, like worth it to me. Like I just wanted to be good enough, like I didn't need to be the best. So the principle I think that is the hardest for me to apply is the second one, to make things irreversible. Because I think I'm someone who, for most of my life, I've always liked to have options and to keep optionality. So I would agree with certain things, like certain decisions like marriage. It makes sense to, for it to be kind of an irreversible thing. But even with that, it was something I struggled with. I mean, I was someone who actually didn't believe in marriage, until I actually got married. Yeah. I always like wanted to find someone that would agree to like just be a partner, and not have to get married. And I always felt like you don't need a paper, certificate to prove that you love someone, right? But I have to admit that now that I'm married, it's not something I struggle with, and in a way that irreversibility is a good container for a relationship. But yeah, that's the one that I have the most challenge with.
I agree with you, because I'm the opposite of you. Obviously, I'm not married, and then this is funny to say in this particular video, but I'm just going to say it like I don't believe in marriage. So but I say that personally. Like I know marriage works for a lot of people, so don't get me wrong. Like to me, it's more like a idealistic. It's a very high ideal, right? And I'm of the belief that, like with most things in life, like some achievements are kind of like reserved for certain sorts of people or certain sorts of circumstances. Certain degree of luck is required, and not everything is just based on willpower. And it's nice that some people can meet that ideal of like 50 years marriage and all these other kind of goals. But for me, you're right. I find this second tip not something I can agree with 100%, but I get the spirit of it. Like you don't want to go into a relationship and like at the first whim of trouble, oh okay, I can break up and just move on to the next one. So I do think that you need a very high threshold. You got a very high standard about like when you're going to reverse a decision, and the standards have to be based on some ethical grounds. Yeah. So if a marriage, sad to say, if it's getting dysfunctional, I do think that for the sake of a higher ideal, maybe for both parties to seek better futures in their life, then perhaps like separation and divorce is required. Yeah. So I was going to talk a bit about the gratitude one, because he didn't say much about it, and I do want to elaborate like what gratitude means to me. So I think you probably know about this idea called the 5 love languages.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
right.
familiar with it. Yeah.
So I mean, I'm not really going to go through all of it, because it's not really about what they are. But to me, I feel that one very simple way to practice gratitude, and I'm making it relevant to our context right now, being under a lockdown and everything, is just really message your friends and show them that you care about them. Yeah, like that's what I did. Like for my work, because of the lockdown, I couldn't reach out to. I mean, I couldn't do things as per normal. So meet the people that I usually work with. Yeah, and there's always a worry on my end that whether they miss out, whether they start to distance themselves from the relationship that we have, and they feel like, oh, it's no longer relevant. Yeah. And what I really try to do is just drop a message. Just it can be a very simple thing like, hey, how's work? And to me, I'm kind of saying it also for maybe the people who are my friends who are listen to this, but it's my sign of showing that I'm still thinking of you. And I actually made a personal Facebook post a couple of months back, where a couple of clients who I didn't see for the whole of last year, I totally didn't see these clients. but they're very dear to me. Yeah, and they had legitimate fears about the pandemic, so we didn't see each other. But when we had a chance to see each other, like it was, ecstatic, like really, really over the top, and we really felt like, hey, even though we spent almost a whole year not seeing each other, but it's like as if we never were alone. Like yeah. And the thing is that even though we didn't really talk much within that year, because everyone was busy in their own lives, but when we reconnected, that exercise of gratitude was just evident. And that's how I think, in a world where if we don't need to pleasure our friends or please our friends with like, hey, let's show gratitude by going on a big holiday, have a big nice meal, and and some people have very limited means, right? Not everyone can afford treating friends to a nice meals and stuff like that. I think that all the more timeless and valuable it is to practice gratitude through very simple means of communication and very sincere messages. So that's kind of like what I really like about this tip.
Yeah.
There was something I was going to bring up because you said something about well, okay, anyway, so what's what do you think our readers should take away from this video?
Well, hopefully they will be intrigued by the book and check it out. I will put the book, I guess, in its humble place in that I don't know if it will convince someone who is not already aligned with what it's saying. I mean, in my case, as I said, I already agree with so much of it, and I appreciated the different layers and different arguments he brought into it. There's a part of me that wonders if, for someone to really get to that space of being able to not be worried about missing out, that they can't just read a bunch of philosophical arguments to get there. It may have to be something like a life crisis that catalyzes that, or something that sends them on a more spiritual path, whether it's like meditation, I think is a great pathway to get to that point. So yeah.
Yeah, I that's what we were kind of referring to when we had our previous video, the introduction video on reading, and how I said that there's only so much, there's a certain limitation to whether reading a book can change your life, and you're right. I think that this book already preaches to the converted. So I will put it this way. I'm going to use an example. I mean, it's going to be a little bit maybe far-fetched for some of our viewers, but basically, like, I have a friend who felt like he, so just to give some context, he's a trainer and he's a very physically talented person. He's actually not Singaporean, he's in the US. And he actually has this thing going on his, let's say, social media account and on his social messaging to his own fans, that he felt like he paid a very heavy price when he was training really hard, like about 5-10 years ago. So he was training like 6 hours a day. He could do one-arm handstands. He could lift very heavy, and he was a very talented MMA mixed martial arts artist. Yeah, but he found out that he had some chronic condition, autoimmune disease. Yeah, which paid very dearly for him, and he kind of felt like the reason why he got himself into this mess was because he was fearing missing out of his training. Like, he felt like, hey, if I don't train 6 hours a day, I'm missing out on being the best athlete that I can be. And that's really prevalent in my line of work, where there are so many and look, these people like fitness influencers, fitness celebrities, they have good intentions in trying to tell people to believe in themselves, try to overcome hurdles and maximize your potential. So the intention behind it isn't evil, but I think, like what happened to my friend, you can go very overboard with it. There is a price to be paid sometimes for going to extremes. Yeah, and now his messaging is very different. Like, he only trains like, say, 1 hour a week, and he tries to develop a more efficient training system. And going along with what you just said, that is an example of a life crisis that happened to him, and now his message is to defeat FOMO, because he's telling everyone now, be careful of FOMO because you will pay a price for it, and that's what can happen. So I guess what I would like to do is just maybe conclude this video with a quote from the book, because I think this maybe would help, at least for those people who have at least listened to us so far. Maybe this catchphrase might help to kind of give them some kind of defining direction. So he says here, right, this is the statement I'm going to quote now. We can all learn to focus, to opt out, to settle for less of that which is actually trivial, and then hopefully have more time for what is significant. And the anthropologist Harry Walcott used to advise his PhD students to do less but more thoroughly. And perhaps more of us should heed this advice, not just for our studies, but throughout our lives. And we need to have that courage to commit to something and to not worry about missing out more. And that's kind of like what I plan to do also I think also it's the life stage thing, because we are not young. So I think naturally it comes to us also that there's only so many things we can do. Why not do those few things that we are fully committed to better, and with our heart, right? With purity of will. So yeah.
All right. Well, spending an hour doing this book review is definitely not something I will have regrets over. I mean, I could have watched Netflix, but this was a totally enjoyable way to spend the time. So
yeah, great. So just to conclude, just as a lead on to the next one. So this is just to say that to our viewers. So this is really not an introduction video, right? So we're really working on a topic here, on a theme, and moving on, we're going to do stuff like that. So we have stuff planned on. So we didn't talk about the political aspect of this book, by the way, the political arguments about a sustainable planet and how that's important, to curb our fear of missing out. So we're probably going to address that later in a subsequent video. So that's one. And I'm actually looking forward to, if we're going to do it next week, let's do our first coffee break session where anything and everything goes. Yeah.
Sure, sounds good.